Hello, everyone. Welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell, and our guest today is Andy Burrows. Andy has deep connections with books, from production, publishing, editing, sales, advertising, and design, from Stephen Green Press here in the 60s to the Brattleboro Words Project and the Right Action Writers community of today. He's also a poet and a writer. Also, Andy is an educator. He is the co-founder of Pro Lingua, which is a publisher of language teaching books and materials known worldwide. Andy served on many boards and committees in Brattleboro, Guilford, and on Vermont Public Radio. And he's part of Right Action's April Project, Poems Around Town, which many of you have probably seen in the windows of our storefronts here in town. Andy, welcome so much to Here We Are.
Thank you, Wendy. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're so glad to see you. And you have so many things that you have done in the Brattleboro area that we're going to have to just skip right through them and see what we come up with.
Yes, it might be kind of dizzying if we try to cover them all.
Yes, it will be kind of dizzying. We'll see how well we do. So, Andy, you were born in the suburbs of Chicago,
Right.
but you came east for college, and so you've been mainly an East Coast guy since then.
Yeah, that's true. I came for high school, for prep school, but and then for college.
Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about this, that pretty much everything you've done has had to do with books, publishing, something like that. And I'm just wondering if what got you interested? Did you get interested at a young age? And was it books? Was it language? Was it communication? Can you pinpoint anything in particular?
Again, I mentioned that I had come east to a boarding school in the East, and at that time I started writing various things, stories and poems and whatnot, and I served on the board of the literary magazine, and that I just enjoyed doing that, and I continued doing that in college, and I don't know. I was trying to figure, what am I going to do when I grow up? And I knew I was always going to be writing poetry, but that's not what you do when you grow up. So I said, I really should be involved in books, in publishing. But I had also, even before I went away to school, in middle school, I started being interested in printing. And so there was a wonderful print shop at the school that I went to. I learned how to print on basically a Benjamin Franklin flatbed press, right? Going back to Gutenberg, virtually, setting the type by hand. So I've been fascinated with printing all the way through as an art form and as a way of communicating.
Yes, yeah. And so you started on a press, so that makes sense. So and you also you studied publication, is that right, at Radcliffe?
Yes.
Yes.
When I finished college, again, what am I going to do when I grow up? Publishing seemed like a logical thing to do. Somebody suggested to me that the Radcliffe had a graduate course in publishing procedures, and I might get in. So I applied. Well, there were probably 30 of us, 2 men, and the rest of them were all women. And Doily Venn, who was the woman who was running it, said, okay, rule number 1, I want you all to be sure you know how to type and type well, because that will get you into the publishing industry. You've got to get words on paper, and that means you 2 guys too. Luckily, I already knew how to type.
Her advice is still true.
It is true,
Right?
yeah.
Learning how to type is absolutely basic to anything. Yeah.
And it's that kind of grunt work in a way, and probably in all industries. If you want to get into them, to get started, if you can do something which is really practical and helpful on the ground level, and you do it well, people will recognize it and you'll go up.
Right. Keep your head down and work really well, right? Follow directions.
I hope both of my children are listening.
And actually, was it during that time that led you to Brattleboro?
Yes, well, a bit after that, but sort of through that connection. I had taken some time after finishing at Radcliffe to take a boat down the Mississippi, the length of the Mississippi. I went to Europe. I ended up in Beirut for a number of months and traveling around Syria. Came back because somehow I had to get a job, and I came back to Boston and tried to find a job in publishing. And my friend who was running the Radcliffe Publishing Procedure course said, Andy, I just got a message from an old friend of mine, a fellow by the name of Stephen Green, who I have known. His family has been on Beacon Hill since the beginning, and he's a wonderful guy. He and his wife are running a little tiny publishing house up in Brattleboro, Vermont. You think you might be interested in interviewing? Well, I had been 4 months trying to break into Houghton Mifflin and Little Brown without success. So I said, sure, I'll go up. Yeah, Vermont, let me think. I've never been there. It's sort of got woods. It's like the great Northwest, because I grew up in the Northwest in Chicago, and I looked up to Minnesota and Upper Michigan and whatnot. And so I decided I would drive up on a nice day and see it. And I met them. It was one of the great days of my life. I mean, just wonderful people. And I came driving into this town. And the first thing that I saw was the old outlet center, which was a factory store at that point for moccasins. Mm-hmm. Which had been one of the things that I enjoyed up in Minnesota, where they had Indian moccasins being made in factory stores. I said, gee, this rings a bell. Maybe I will like it here. I got downtown and found my way to the bookseller, and I said, oh my God, I have died and gone to heaven. Imagine having anything to do with a bookstore like this. It was great fun. It's very personal publishing.
Personal publishing, yes, absolutely. And back then, so this was like about 66, I think, that you came here. So Stephen Green and his wife owned the bookseller and then had Stephen Green Press in the basement there of that building.
That's as I remember it. They bought they from Sam Lincoln. They bought the bookseller, because they thought it would be wonderful fun to have a bookstore in Brattleboro, and they loved Brattleboro. They actually lived up in Dover, but they thought that would be great. But they really wanted to get into publishing, and so maybe they could tie that in with owning the bookstore. So the Stephen Green Press really spun off of all their connections through the bookstore.
I see. Yeah, that's great. And you were there for 5 years.
Yes, I was.
And you did a little bit of everything, it sounds like.
Yes, pretty much. There were Hannah Bacazzi. The Bacazzi family was the secretary that did a lot of the secretarial work for Steve and Jan, and there were a couple of other people who. Irene Gilbert and a couple of other sort of secretary people who worked for the bookseller and for the Stephen Green Press. But it was a very small group, and Steve was very busy finding new books, dealing with salespeople, writing contracts and whatnot. Jan was doing her magic in taking sort of half-baked manuscript and ending up with a really superb book on whatever the subject was. And that left all the things that they had been having so much trouble with, getting the books printed and keeping track of what was going on. And so that was my job to work with them, go to all the printers in town, go to the typesetters, go to the wonderful book designer we worked with in Guilford, Robert Dothard, and it was a baptism in the whole publishing industry. I knew about it academically
Yeah.
from my time at Radcliffe, but this was hands-on,
Right.
the whole thing.
Yes, right, right, right. And it was doable at that time. It's amazing how inclusive it was of all aspects of
Yeah.
publishing and book selling too. You know, Andy, could you give your first impression of driving into Brattleboro?
Yeah, yeah. Well, as I said, it was a small. It seemed a smaller town, certainly than Boston, which I had gotten used to. I was enchanted by the moccasin store, and then I got down onto Main Street, and the I had no way of comparing it to other towns in Vermont. uh, Brattleboro is all but unique in the state in that it has a sort of a canyon. It has these buildings built up on either side of Main Street, and elegant, many of them elegant old buildings. And so, I went and found a place to park, and I got into the bookseller, and then they suggested that I stay at the Latches, so I went down and got a room at the Latches where I stayed for a while. And it took me, and I was so busy doing other things that it must have taken me a week or so when I just needed to get up and get some air. And so I went out and I walked down Main Street, and I got down near the bridge, and I was thunderstruck because I'd been in the canyon, and suddenly here was this amazing river and this beautiful mountain behind it. And so I went back to the office and I said, Hannah Bakazi, I said, Hannah, what's this? I said, there's no place in Brattleboro that you can see the river and the mountain. And this is the most beautiful spot. In Europe, it's an incredibly beautiful spot. And she said, what? What are you talking about? I said, well, that mountain over there. And she said, the mountain? Nobody would want to look at the mountain.
Wow.
I said, well, why?
Yeah.
Well, it's ugly. It was burned. I said, it was? She said, yeah, it's a disaster. It was burned. I said, when? She said, in 1927. I said, Hannah, have you looked at it recently? It's changed.
Wow.
Certainly has. Brattleboro has always had, for many, many, many years, turned its back
Absolutely
on the mountain and
Yeah.
on the river. They used it for transportation, basically.
Yes. Andy, you mentioned when you first came to Brattleboro, or when you had spent some time here, that there was an Alice in Wonderland quality to it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Of course, it was the late 60s, so we were dealing with a lot of white rabbits and various things.
That is true. And it was it's interesting because I really wasn't. I never was into drugs. I smoked a little pot, but I was working hard at this new job and trying to learn about publishing and all of this. And little by little, as the 60s and the early 70s developed, it became a mecca for people like myself, young people, who were looking to escape to the country and find a different way of life. Well, I had found it. I mean, I was deeply engaged in the history of Brattleboro and all the industries and whatnot, and getting to know the people at the newspaper and whatnot. So I at that point was not at all involved in the back to the land movement.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, I decided to buy a house, searched around, and found a house in Guilford.
Mm-hmm.
And it did not take long to discover that Guilford was one of the centers in the United States for the hippies, for the back to the land
Yes.
natural people. I can remember sitting in front of my house and hearing with my golden retriever and hearing chatter and bells and what the heck is this? Looking up at the road above me and seeing 30 or 40 people, more or less my own age, some of them very attractive, walking up the road, laughing and just walking past. And of course, my retriever immediately forgot me entirely and followed them up the road.
Sure.
And so eventually I discovered Johnson's Pastures and the Lost Farm up in that whole area, all the communes and whatnot.
Right. Yeah.
I had really been more or less not aware of them in what I was doing in downtown Brattleboro. I was too much of a stuffed shirt.
Well, you were focused. You were focused in a different way.
Right.
And so after that, you went to SIT, and you wanted to live abroad, and you got a master's in teaching.
Right. Yep.
And you were doing English as a second language.
When I went to SIT, the very first day I got there, as one of a class of 37, I met Elise, who is my wife and partner, and we were not together at that point. I went to Washington, and she went to Northfield to teach French and Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to come back and marry her and get back involved in Vermont.
Yeah.
And, so I did. Northfield Mount Hermon, of course, is a prep school.
Mm-hmm.
And we convinced them that you could run an intensive English program with students from around the world who would live on campus with American roommates and participate in the life of an American school. That's the thing that had never been done before, and it was phenomenally successful.
So Andy, you're working at SIT, you're getting your master's in teaching. You did curriculum design and program administration for the Peace Corps. You're working in a lot of different directions and broadening everything that you've been learning in the program. How did Pro Lingua come out of this?
I was working with Ray Clark, who was the director of the master's program up at SIT.
Mm-hmm.
And things evolved, and he left the master's program there, and he was asked to design a program for the Peace Corps. That was I never was in the Peace Corps. He had been,
Mm-hmm.
but we developed materials for the Peace Corps. And when that program was finished, we were looking for something to do. I always seem to have been doing that. And we came up with the idea of running our own little publishing house,
Mm-hmm.
which with a couple of other friends, Pat Moran particularly, we started Pro Lingua, to publish ESL materials and perhaps other language materials.
Uh-huh.
And we didn't run programs out of it. It was basically trying to come up with the kinds of materials that teachers could use to make their classes interactive, to get the students involved.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully, here's a book, the teacher's going to have to use creativity to develop a lesson. And that's always been the dynamism of our Pro Lingua materials.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Yes. And you created an empire.
No, it's tiny.
And so extracurricularly, you've been involved with Right Action, and you've been involved with the Brattleboro Words Project, which is a multi-pronged project. And I wonder if you could, I know that you've just come out with a book called Print Town,
Mhm.
and it's fabulous. It's wonderful. People should pick it up. It's available at everyone's books and Brattleboro Museum and Art Center, and also online with the Brattleboro Historical Society. So could you give us a quick picture of the Words Project itself? Because I know you've got so many things going on, and then a
Sure.
little bit about the new book.
Yep. I got Tom Regal of Marlboro invited me we became friends, and he suggested that I get involved with Right Action. Right Action was looking for a project, and um, Arlene Disler, who was basically running it, was the founder of it with her husband. We were talking about things and came up with the idea of developing a book or a lot of displays and whatnot on the history of Brattleboro's publishing and printing, because it engaged all these writers and poets and whatnot. And that led to the Words Project. We were able to get a wonderful grant from the what is it called? The National Arts? No.
National Endowment for the Arts.
National Endowment for the Arts.
Yes.
And that funded it, and it is not just the book, but a wonderful walking tour and driving tour around this part of the state to see the places where famous writers like Kipling and others lived. And so that was a fascinating project.
What I've noticed in the last couple of years is that you've had more of a focus on the indigenous culture, the local tribal connections here. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. As we started talking about what was involved in the whole use of words, of the written language in our community and our history. Obviously, there was printing. Obviously, there were marvelous writers. There was publishing. But we dug deeper and realized that it's been in Brattleboro since before 1800. And before that, there was the Native Americans. There was an indigenous culture with stories and sending messages back and forth and communicating throughout Vermont. And Brattleboro was one of the centers, in effect, one of the focuses. And so we got Rich Holkers to join our group, and there were a number of other people who were really interested in that. They did more research than I did, but I've always been interested in that, and so I got engaged in trying to feed material into the process. And when it was all edited, it's an important part of the first third of the book, perhaps, because it's an important part of our history.
That's right. And it's wonderful that it's included in the book as well. And again, I just have to say to folks that, pick up a copy of this, at least take a look through it. It's remarkable. I think many of us have known that there's been a lot, the first Harry Potter was published here. We know all kinds of different pieces of information, but it's much broader and wider than we ever thought at all.
Once we had finished that, then we took a deep breath and said, well, what are we going to do next? And somehow out of the discussion came up with the idea of doing something like what was being done in Montpelier, which was to take National Poetry Month and fill the whole town full of poems on the windows of shops all over town. And so we put out the call for poets in Greater Brattleboro. What have you been doing during this year of pandemic? Doesn't have to be about pandemic, but where's your head? Where's your heart? I cannot believe the excellence of the poems that were submitted. And we sorted through them. I printed them up, set them up so with the help of Jim Brisson, beautiful design for the frame to go on the windows all around town. And then our hope, we have two spin-offs of that. One is that we're going to invite the authors, some of them anyway, to read their poems on a Zoom kind of a open reading kind of thing. And then also to gather all of these great poems and put together a book of poems from the time of the pandemic. it's going to be a classic because they're really good poems.
Yeah.
Many of them are.
Yes. Yeah. So for the audience too, for everyone out there to know that for the month of April, and I know there's not much left, but go around town and take a look in the windows of the stores, and you will be surprised. And it's wonderful because, of course, downtown isn't bustling like it usually is, so you can actually take the time to stop and read these poems. And there are many. There are probably at least 50 or 60, I think, around town. And it just, it's such a great Brattleboro thing.
As part of this Poems Around Town, we are not only publishing the book, but we're also doing this reading. And the reading is going to be on Thursday, the 22nd at 6:30. So
Great.
if people are interested, they can get involved.
Will they sign up then on your site to get a Zoom link and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Andy, thank you so much. This is a wealth of information in a nutshell.
It's been fun. Too much to cover, but it's been fun.
Oh, it's been great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay. Thanks to all of you for joining us today again. And it is April Poetry Month. So any of you who are interested in poetry, I hope you're taking advantage of that. And definitely check out downtown Brattleboro. The windows of the shops downtown are filled with poetry. And it's really lovely. Andy's poem actually is in the George Brooks, I think it's inside the shop. You can check that out there. Go into the beautiful floral shop of George Brooks. And tune in again next week. We will be here. Thanks for joining us.